So welcome everyone to the fourth online event for the Gothic Women Project. Today we're considering the works of Anne Radcliffe, one of the most significant figures in the early Gothic canon, sometimes referred to as one of the founders of Gothic fiction. For over 200 years, Radcliffe's works have charmed and terrified her readers, and as an understanding of her work is really still crucial in any scholarly understandings of late 18th and early 19th century literature. A hugely popular and commercially successful writer, it's often her fourth novel, The Mysteries of Udolpho, which first appeared in 1794, that Radcliffe is most well remembered by. For example, as I'm sure many of you will know, it is the novel that Catherine Morland eagerly reads in Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey. Yet Radcliffe's body of work goes far beyond that text, across novels, other novels, travel writing, and essays. And that is the focus, therefore, of our event today. We're delighted to welcome three expert speakers, Elizabeth Bobbitt, Deborah Russell, and Angela Wright, to the Zoom call today. And they will each present short talks before we open the floor to an audience Q&A. So yes, do find the chat function and put your questions in the chat, starting with the letter Q. You can put them at any time during the talks. But without any further ado, I think we should pass straight over to our Radcliffe experts. Starting the event this evening is Professor Angela Wright. Angela Wright is Professor of Romantic Literature in the School of English at the University of Sheffield. Her major publications include Britain, France, and the Gothic, The Import of Terror, 1764 to 1820, Mary Shelley, and a number of, the volume simply on Mary Shelley with the University of Wales Press, which is an excellent book, and a number of co-edited collections with Dale Townsend, who I can see is here, so that's nice. So these edited collections include Anne Radcliffe, Romanticism and the Gothic, Romantic Gothic, an Edinburgh Companion, and volumes 1 and 2 of the Cambridge History of the Gothic. Her current projects are the first major edition of the works of Anne Radcliffe for Cambridge University Press, something that will be the focus of our talks this evening, where she is general co-editor with Michael Gamer. And she's also editing the Mysteries of Udolpho in that edition. The Mysteries of Udolpho should appear in late 2023. She is also general co-editor with Dale Townsend of a new book series on the Gothic with Cambridge University Press called Gothic Elements, and is completing her next book-length study entitled Fostering Romanticism. Over to you, Angela.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you so much for organising this wonderful event, Gothic Women. And I'm really delighted to be here and to share my research. When I was asked to do this, I did hesitate because the title for this event this evening is Beyond Udolpho. And of course, I am editing the Mysteries of Udolpho, and I'm on sabbatical this semester, and my major purpose this semester is to edit it. So I hope that you'll forgive me if I actually say some stuff about Udolpho. What I'm going to do in my talk is talk about the sort of aftermath of Udolpho after saying a few things about it and the importance of reading in it. So please do excuse me for not fully following the brief. Because I'm coming to you from a very snowy, icy Sheffield, where I slipped in the ice yesterday, I thought I would begin by an observation from a young man in Sheffield who was 14 years old, Joseph Hunter, who was an apprentice in Sheffield and who went on to become a famous antiquarian and Unitarian minister. And if you go to Sheffield Archives, you can read his journals there. And it's kind of interesting. I've put a screenshot of it, but obviously it won't be that big to you. Sorry, I'll make this a proper presentation. There we go. Right in the bottom paragraph of this excerpt of his diary, he records his experience of going to the Surrey Street subscription library in the centre of Sheffield and trying and failing often to get hold of volume 2 of Anne Radcliffe's The Italian. And he eventually does get hold of it and says in 1797, in one day, finished the second volume of Mrs. Radcliffe's The Italian. She is the best writer in her way of anybody I ever heard of. He was just 14 an apprentice, and he read volume 2 in one day and then went back to Surrey Street Library the next day to try and borrow volume 3. And elsewhere in this diary, he also talks about reading Udolpho as well. So Hunter tapped on something that I'll say is quite interesting with Radcliffe. She is the best writer in her way of anybody I ever heard of. That in her way is interesting because it suggests that, he was reading a number of Gothic romances and was able to forge those comparisons, but possibly also his opinion was formed from the periodicals of the day and what other people were saying about Radcliffe at that time. So in this slide, we have a few famous assessments of Anne Radcliffe. Walter Scott saying Mrs. Radcliffe has a title to be considered the first poetess of romantic fiction. Now that came much later, his assessment of her, but again, it's that first poetess of romantic fiction, but she was the exception in her craft. Nathan Drake called her the Shakespeare of romance writers. His was closer to Joseph Hunter's assessment of her in 1798. Thomas Green, who wrote and made a comparison with Walpole's Castle of Otranto, read Otranto, which grievously disappointed my expectations. The tale is in itself insipid, and Mrs. Radcliffe, out of possible contingencies, evokes scenes of far more thrilling horror. That one came in 1810. And then an anonymous comment, it has been pretended that original, or rather creative genius belongs not to the female sex, but who has more indisputably possessed that attribute than the Enchantress of Udolpho? So all of these assessments of her emphasise her exceptionalism, her creative genius, her evocation of scenes of far more thrilling horror. And I think that in many ways, these assessments come, of course, post-Udolpho, as the date suggests, but also in the wake of the Mysteries of Udolpho in particular, because I really do love it, the Castles of Atlan and Dunbane, a Sicilian romance, and a Romance of a Forest, which came prior to the Mysteries of Udolpho. I think we're all, in their own rights, really wonderful creations. And in particular, I'm interested in the Romance of a Forest as being very different to the Mysteries of Udolpho and the way in which it presents its heroine. But that said, I think that Udolpho changes the reception of Anne Radcliffe in a very particular way, and what people think of her and how they write about her. So in order to justify that claim, I'm going to look now briefly at the title page of The Mysteries of Udolpho, a romance. And there we see that original one. It was published by the Robinsons in 1794 in London. And George Robinson, this was the first of Radcliffe's works that he published. He also published A Journey, which came out in 1795, Radcliffe's Travelogue. But he paid Anne Radcliffe the sum of £500 as a publisher's advance for The Mysteries of Udolpho, and was clearly very pleased to get his hands on this particular one. And the way in which the title page presents itself, interspersed with some pieces of poetry, and the way in which she signs herself not as Mrs. Radcliffe, which many of the male writers called her, but as Anne Radcliffe, I think is important. I also think the little fragment of poetry here is really important too, and I'll read it out for you. I've also typed it out up there. Fate sits in these dark battlements and frowns, and as the portals open to receive me, her voice in sullen echoes through the courts tells of a nameless deed. Now, this irregular fragment of poetry, I think, offers a metaphor for what is to follow, not just at the level of the plot of The Mysteries of Udolpho, but also at the level of a relationship between the novel and the reader. For the portals of the castle are opening, just as the portals of a novel on the title page are opening to the breathless reader who waits as an anticipation for what is to happen to this nameless me that the portals are opening to receive. Fate is also feminized here, warning this kind of nameless protagonist, one imagines female, about what awaits her, the nameless deed. And that deed is only articulated through uncertainty. We do not know what deed is about to be committed, or indeed, what it is. But it echoes, I think, Macduff's reaction to the murder of Macbeth in Shakespeare's tragedy, where Macduff in Act 2 says, "Oh, horror, 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 tongue nor heart cannot conceive nor name thee." There is no language to account for what this nameless deed is. Language cannot frame it. And I think in many ways, the Mysteries of Udolpho plays with that idea from Macbeth that the deed must remain nameless because language cannot contain it. I mean, in volume 4, we do learn of some of the crimes committed in the Mysteries of Udolpho, but throughout the Mysteries of Udolpho, there is a hesitation, a shortcoming in language Saint-Aubert cannot express to his daughter Emily, who becomes the heroine of the 4 volumes, what exactly has happened to his sister. And Emily also cannot represent in language the scenes that she witnesses where the villain Montoni is harassing her aunt. Everything is all about hesitation and uncertainty in the novel. So I think that The Mysteries of Udolpho is in many ways Radcliffe's most self-referential novel. That title page tells us that she's thinking very carefully about reading and what the act of reading, but also the act of writing, can represent to us, what language can do, and what she must leave up to her reader. It offers us scenes of reading as well within the novel that I think are really important to this particular novel. We know from volume 1 that Saint-Aubert, the classic Enlightenment tutor of his daughter, teaches Emily, the heroine, Latin and English, chiefly that she might understand the sublimity of their best poets. She discovered in her early years a taste for works of genius, and it was Saint-Aubert's principle as well as his inclination to promote every innocent means of happiness. Now, that classic education that she receives from Saint-Aubert is not atypical in Radcliffe's fiction. In The Romance of the Forest, we also find Adeline reading the works of Shakespeare and others, but it does tell us what a heroine ought to read in some ways in order to withstand the horrors that are about to beset her. But it also shows us in some ways the shortcomings of reading, and I think that that links back to that fragment of poetry on the title page, the inadequacy of language. Because when Emily is firmly imprisoned in the castle of Udolpho, in the novel, she finds that actually, the enthusiasm of genius with all its pictured scenes now appear cold and dim. She finds that she cannot go to the classics in which Saint-Aubert has so carefully tutored her because they do not actually match up to the experience of a horror that she encounters. And that in many ways is this simulation of the sublime, the kind of unnameability of the horror which confronts Emily throughout the novel. There is, however, one further bit of reading in The Mysteries of Udolpho, which actually promises a better thing. And I want to speak about that and the reception of it very briefly. And that's where, in the final volume of a novel, at Chateau Leblanc, Ludovico, who's a servant and who has volunteered to stay in a chamber where a ghost, people think that they've seen a ghost, and of course it isn't a ghost, stays up all night by the fire with a glass of wine, reading, and he comes across a volume which contains a story called the Provencal Tale. The damp corner into which it had fallen had caused the cover to be disfigured and mouldy, and the leaves to be so discoloured with spots, but it was not without difficulty the letters could be traced. And Radcliffe gives us here a kind of account of the ascendancy of romance and the mobility of it coming from Arabian legends brought by the Saracens into Spain through to France, and kind of gives us this sense of the marvellous actually being a consequence of romance and its heritage from the Saracens coming through Arabia into mainland Europe. So it's a really interesting episode in the novel because it kind of goes across several pages as it shows you Ludovico reading this particular tale. And there's incredible descriptions in it that you don't get as much in other parts of Udolpho and the previous three novels, of kind of banquet scenes from medieval times, gorgeous banners, sumptuous canopies, profusion of gold and silver that glittered in the sideboards, the numerous dishes that covered the tables, the number and gay liveries of the attendants, with the chivalric and splendid attire of the guests, united to form a scene of magnificence, such as we may not hope to see in these degenerate days. I'm really interested in that word degenerate, because Radcliffe doesn't typically pass judgment. But I think that it's very interesting that she's smuggled in there some sort of commentary upon that present day in which Emily finds herself. But I think what's more interesting than this as well is that the tale, the Provencal tale of an English knight who's requested by the ghost of a French knight who has been murdered to bury him with honours, bears more than a passing resemblance, to my mind, to Radcliffe's final posthumously published romance, Gaston de Blonville, in its use of the unexplained supernatural and in its tale of a knight wrongly murdered. And I think that this was the prototype for her final work, Gaston. So I know that I'm almost out of time, but I'd just like to kind of give you very quickly a brief survey of why William Hazlitt kind of liked Udolpho in particular. He said that he preferred her to Frances Burney, a contentious opinion, no doubt. But Hazlitt commented upon the greatest treat that Radcliffe's pen had provided must surely be the Provencal tale read by Ludovico in Udolpho. And that was echoed by Walter Scott in his prefatory memoir of 1824, who cited the reading of the Provencal tale as being something that was much more effective in Radcliffe because there wasn't that explained supernatural. And Leigh Hunt also echoed those views and excerpted Ludovico and the Haunted Chamber in his 2-volume anthology of short and occasional literary amusements, A Book for a Coroner, and said that it was one of the most favourite in her writings. Now, nowadays, I don't think that we think that about the Provencal tale. I think often it's overlooked, that tale within a tale, but I do think that the assessments of the Romantic authors there bear testament to the way in which Udolpho in that particular tale became important to them. So Radcliffe became so successful and so inspirational to others in the wake of Udolpho. The Mysteries of Udolpho ran to no fewer than 13 editions between 1794 and 1824 in London, and that's notwithstanding editions in Dublin and over in America as well. It was rapidly translated into French, German, and Italian, with Victorine de Chastenay, who was a minor aristocrat, translating it into French in 1797. And of course, it acted as inspiration to other would-be Gothic authors. Catherine Cuthbertson's Romance of the Pyrenees which George Robinson commissioned in 1803. He obviously wanted to capitalise upon that. The Veiled Picture of a Mysteries of Gogorno, and T.J. Horsley Curtis's A Monk of Udolpho, about which Dale Townsend could tell you a lot. So just to finish off, I wanted to give you a snapshot of a woman reading Radcliffe on first reading The Mysteries of Udolpho, Matilda Betham's poem, Lines to Mrs. Radcliffe. Accept the tribute of a heart which thou hast often made to glow with transport, oft with terror start, or sink at strains of solemn woe. And I'll leave it there with that snapshot of a female reading and celebrating Udolpho. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angela. That was fantastic. Really loved the significance of other creative people's commentary on Radcliffe and her works, and the inspiration that she delivered to other writers is just obviously so important, inspiring not just the prose commentary, but responses in verse as well. Yeah, I have loads of questions, but let's move on to our next speaker first of all. Thank you, Angela. So next up is Dr. Deborah Russell, and Deborah is a senior lecturer in the Centre for 18th Century Studies and the Department of English and Related Literature at the University of York. She works on Romantic period Gothic fiction and theatre, with a particular emphasis on women's writing, dynamics of national identity, and the politics of silence on stage. She is one of the organisers of the Gothic Women project, along with, as you will also see here tonight, Laura Kirkley, Daniel Cook, myself, they're waving now, and Lauren Nixon, our Gothic Women Fellow. And she is also the volume editor of Anne Radcliffe's The Castles of Atlan and Dunbane for the upcoming Cambridge edition of the works of Anne Radcliffe. Series editors Michael Gamer and Angela Wright. She has also just signed, and I think this is actually really, really recent news, Deborah, isn't it? She's just signed a contract to produce a new edition of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein for the Oxford World Classics series. So congratulations, Deborah. That's really exciting. Today she'll be talking about the politics of place in the castles of Atlan and Dunbane.
Thank you very much. Now I just need to share this. There we go. Can you see that okay?
That looks great. Yeah.
Brilliant. So yes, hi everybody. It's really great to be able to discuss Radcliffe with so many people this evening, and to be on a panel with such wonderful Radcliffe scholars. So yeah, as Anna said, my paper is about Radcliffe's first novel, The Castles of Atlan and Dunbane. So this was first published anonymously in 1789, when Radcliffe was in her mid-20s. Nearly 30 years later, John Keats wrote a letter to John Hamilton Reynolds in which he warned his friend that he might be about to come over a bit Radcliffean. Buy a girdle, put a pebble in your mouth, loosen your braces, for I am going among scenery whence I intend to tip you the Damoiselle Radcliffe. I'll cavern you and grotto you and waterfall you and wood you and water you and immense rock you and tremendous sound you and solitude you. Keats's light-hearted evocation of Radcliffe shows how much her writing is associated with a particular kind of landscape, or perhaps a particular response to that landscape. In 1798, Nathan Drake, calling Radcliffe the Shakespeare of romance writers, rhapsodized about how her novels offered scenes truly terrific in their conception, yet softened down by the intermixture of beautiful description. For Drake, this resulted in verbal versions of the wild landscapes of Salvator Rosa, combined with the softer graces of Claude Lorraine. And although Claude and Rosa lived in the previous century, they remained influential on British art throughout the 18th century. So I've put an example of a Rosa-inspired landscape from the 1780s on the slide, which could also easily double as a Radcliffean scene. In evoking those artists, Drake was probably thinking of the famous descriptions of the Apennines, for example, in the Mysteries of Udolpho and the Italian. But in the letter that I've put from Keats on the slide, Keats isn't wandering Italy, he's in Devonshire. It's the home landscape of England that's making him threaten enthusiastic description a la Radcliffe. And that's completely appropriate. While some broad brush characterizations of British Gothic in this period claim that it's mostly set in foreign locales, so predominantly Spain and Italy, Radcliffe, perhaps the defining practitioner of the mode, began her career with British scenes. Her first novel was set not in the Mediterranean like her great 1790s works, but in feudal Scotland. Moreover, at the time, a domestic setting for the Gothic would have been no great surprise. Although Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto had indeed been set in Italy, plenty of other novels from the 1760s, 70s, and 80s combined Gothic elements with an interest in British history. It's really hard, basically, to tease apart the genres of early Gothic and historical fiction at this point. And those are just a few examples on the slide. So what I'd like to do in this paper is to pay attention to this starting point, thinking about what it means for Radcliffe to view Britain's past through a Gothic lens, and more specifically, why it matters that the place in Radcliffe's novel is not the England of these other texts, but Scotland. As you can see here, the novel's subtitle, A Highland Story, draws attention to this as a distinguishing feature. The core trope of the castles of Atlan and Dunbane is commonly acknowledged to be about Britain's political heritage. Atlan and Dunbane, two warring neighbouring castles, represent two competing ways of life and two competing versions of the Gothic. Dunbane is ruled by the proud, oppressive, revengeful Baron Malcolm, who lives in all the pomp of feudal greatness, standing for an absolute authoritarianism that looks backwards in time, so the castle stood a record of the ancient consequence of past possessors. Atlan, on the other hand, draws from the past. It is venerable from its antiquity, it's an ancient seat of feudal government, but that past offers a well-ordered history, compatible with modern ideas of virtue. Formed around a community of Matilda's people and her family, the mention of the children's education also immediately points to the future. From the opening pages then, there's little doubt which castle represents a positive heritage, which one's values might be foundational. Joelle and DeLucia, arguing that this text marks the start of Radcliffe's career-long engagement with Scottish historiography, has pointed out that the different manners of Malcolm and the Earl of Atlan exemplify the two poles of the Scottish Enlightenment stadial view of history, the hot-blooded warlord versus the cultivated peer. This is a text about social and political development, about what is incorporated and what is rejected in the creation of the modern nation. Or perhaps that should be nations. Setting the novel around opposing medieval Scottish castles allows Radcliffe to investigate the status of Scottishness within Britain, 80 years after the Acts of Union that joined the countries, nearly 45 years after Culloden and the subsequent brutal suppression of certain aspects of Scots culture, and in the direct aftermath of the loss of the American colonies at a time when Scots were playing a huge part in defending and building British Empire. For me, what's central to Radcliffe's exploration of Scottishness is the fact that, from the perspective of this English writer, Scotland's past can be depicted as both domestic and foreign. Looked at in one light, that makes it intrinsically uncanny in the Freudian sense. By imagining a part of the nation at a time when it was a separate kingdom, what should be homely becomes strange. At the same time, though, Radcliffe takes care to make the alien familiar. She follows the model of Clara Reid's 1777 novel, The Old English Baron, in making her sympathetic medieval characters echo some of the manners and attitudes of their 18th century readers. This tactic was marked enough for reviewers at the time to criticise her lack of local and historical colour. The interplay of these two impulses, the vacillation between estrangement and familiarisation, enables productive ideological tensions in which different ways of thinking and acting are tested out. For example, should Osbert, the young Earl of Atlan, prioritise revenging his father's death or caring for his desperately worried mother? Is his decision to pursue revenge that of a man of honour, paying attention to his public duty and his people's wishes, or is he simply perpetuating a cycle of damaging clan warfare and making choices that his mother and sister will suffer for? Moving in and out of identification with feudal and sentimental value systems, the novel shows quite clearly that both these judgments carry some force. Even though the novel's villain Malcolm is the character with the most explicitly Scottish name, such tensions ensure that the opposition between the two castles does not translate into anything as simple as the good castle being coded as generally British and the bad castle representing a more specific Scottishness. The two spaces have too much in common for that, in ways that operate as a warning against conflict between neighbours. Rather than clan warfare being a normal state of affairs, for example, it's a marker of the disorder caused by the villainous Baron Malcolm's usurpation of Dunbane's rightful heir. The real Baron Malcolm turns out to be Allan, who's both a more convincing hero than Osbert and more explicitly Scottish, appearing for most of the novel in the manly figure of a young Highland peasant. Radcliffe's two castles also share a probable model. Samuel Johnson's 1775 description of Slains Castle in A Journey to the Western Isles, to which he and James Boswell were invited by the ex-Jacobite Charles Boyd. Johnson's description of the castle's tower as a continuation of a perpendicular rock is echoed in the description of Dunbane, where the rock was almost perpendicular with the walls. But it is Atlan that offers a scene paralleling Johnson's imagined enjoyment of the terrific grandeur of the tempestuous storm lashing the foot of the castle. In Radcliffe's novel, the winds dashed the foaming waves against the rocks with inconceivable fury, and the solemn pauses between stormy gusts filled the mind with enthusiastic awe. This doubling of the castles tests Johnson's assertions about the political history that such places represent, as Radcliffe imagines different versions of the manners of feudal times that might play out in these settings. She includes the lawless and unaccountable baron living with all the licentiousness and insolence of uncontested superiority and unprincipled power in Baron Malcolm, but she also offers an alternative fantasy of benevolent government, creating a version of these castles' pasts that includes women, and which might even eventually learn to pay attention to the intrinsic merit of surprisingly heroic peasants. The novel also exploits the aesthetic admiration found in Johnson's account in order to reframe political assumptions. Boswell describes Johnson as ranking the ocean view at Slains Castle as the noblest he had ever seen, better than the first in England, for example. Along similar lines, Radcliffe may also have been drawing on Thomas Pennant's influential 1769 work, A Tour in Scotland, where the mountains and waters around Loch Lomond form a view that is almost unequalled as to the north Alps upon Alps fill up the amazing view. By evoking European comparisons in this way, Pennant creates a sense of competitive national pride that insists that the British landscape offers as much terrific grandeur as anything found on the continent. Radcliffe's novel operates similarly. She describes the most beautifully romantic spot the hero had ever seen, for example, and throughout deploys a keen awareness of the sublime and picturesque to fashion things British as objects of aesthetic value, as Tony Vine puts it. Her encouragement of a touristic gaze on the wild and barren highlands again encourages the reader simultaneously to identify with and exoticize Scotland, which incidentally is precisely how Catherine Grenier argues that English tourist trips to Scotland actually worked in this period. Interestingly, though, the passage of Pennant's text that resonates most closely with Radcliffe's novel is one that describes a scene not in, but on the way to Scotland, the second passage on the slide here. Just outside Keswick in the Lake District. The landscape in one direction is reminiscent of a smiling, gentle, generous lord, while the crags opposite frown on the scene like a hardened tyrant. The viewer and Pennant's reader is presented with a contrast much like that between Atlan and Dunbane. If this English scene is indeed a thematic model for Radcliffe's Scottish novel, the landscapes of Scotland and England become linked in a way that speaks to the complex intertwined histories of the nation, so Pennant points out that this part of the world was at one time ceded to Scotland, as well as to their shared future. And it's fitting that it's the northern view from Keswick that evokes political progress. In the novel, Radcliffe takes care to evoke James Beattie's poem, The Minstrel, at the outset, with its declaration that freedom fires the soul in Scotland's bleak and barren hills and peaceful vales. A heritage to be proud of is to be found in Radcliffe's Scotland, when approached with the right attitude. After all, her landscape has a marked tendency to transform its character to reflect the political, emotional, and moral dynamics of those who control or even view it. Imprisoned in Dunbane, for example, Osbert gradually transforms the barren objects around him to a sonnet-worthy source of ideal pleasure. The implication that sound morality and good aesthetic taste can reshape the nation's landscape might also work as a meta-commentary on Radcliffe's own approach. Writing in the Gothic mode gives Radcliffe the freedom to take ownership of national spaces and a national past, without being excluded from the narrative by gender or class. In this light, her novel seeks to bridge a sense of disconnect with history, but it also uncovers and performs that rupture with the past. It's notable that the defeat of Malcolm, with the historical dead end that he represents, does not end the narrative. Instead, Osbert's sister Mary encounters further dangers from a seemingly benign family friend, while the darkness of prejudice and ancient pride in Osbert becomes the major problem that must be overcome, with the narrator increasingly clearly condemning him for preventing the worthy Allan from marrying Mary because of Allan's supposedly lowly status and his patriarchal defensiveness of his sister's honour. My colleague Jim Watt comments that Osbert's prejudice and pride here helps to exemplify the way in which Radcliffe's work figures its Scottish Highland setting as remote as well as recognisable. Even with the big political conflict settled, something forbidding remains. The Gothic tropes at work in this extended portion of the narrative indicate a gendered and class-based sense of estrangement from more traditional forms of national history, implying that the conventions of the noble peasant and the virtuous abductee are needed, as without them, certain perspectives wouldn't get included at all. In Radcliffe's world, access to the past is not guaranteed. Her castles contain strange and unexplained spaces, shrouded in obscurity, passages whose stories even the lords of those castles do not know. The false panel remains unknown in Dunbane, as you can see in that quotation on the slide, while Osbert is attacked in the dark in an unfamiliar vault in Atlan. There are also places that seem to be preemptively, anachronistically ruined in ways that suggest that future conflicts are echoing backwards in time. The deserted remains of a hidden place of worship in Dunbane might prefigure the ruins of an abbey whose broken arches and lonely towers arose in gloomy grandeur through the obscurity of evening, a monument of mortality and of ancient superstition, which features in the kidnap of Mary towards the novel's end. And finally, I'd like to end my paper with an acknowledgement that Radcliffe is an absolute expert at ratcheting up tension and then releasing it with a sudden shift in emotion. That's what she famously does in her later novels with the Explained Supernatural. But the tone sometimes shifts without the closure of a corresponding explanation. In the bottom quotation on the slide, I've picked out a passage where Allan, escaping from Dunbane through the cavernous, labyrinthine darkness of the passageways under the castle, finds himself clasping the cold hand of a dead person, producing an agony of terror. From that point, the escape goes more smoothly than expected, and that produces relief all around. But that hand remains a mystery. It's evidence of a story that we just don't get to hear. In the end, using the Gothic to bridge the gap with the Scottish past involves accepting strangeness, living with the fact that some histories aren't ours after all. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Deborah, for such a fascinating talk, another fascinating talk, really bringing out the richness of that landscape and the importance of the nation as something way more complex than you would initially maybe think when you were first reading Radcliffe. I don't know, but that's just some thoughts I was having when I was listening to you, and love that bit about the tension and emotion at the end. Moving on to our final paper, next up is Elizabeth Bovitz. Dr. Elizabeth Bovitz completed her PhD at the University of York in 2019. She has worked as an adjunct lecturer at Schreiner University in Texas, and she is the author of 2 articles on Radcliffe's post-1797 texts, which focus on her final published novel, Gaston de Blonville, from 1826, so quite a bit later than Udolpho, and Radcliffe's narrative verse. She is currently co-editing Radcliffe's posthumously published writing for the upcoming Cambridge editions of Radcliffe's complete works. And her talk today is called Anne Radcliffe, Looking Beyond the 1790s to Radcliffe's later works. Over to you, Elizabeth.
Okay, let me just get my screen shared here. Okay, can everybody see that?
Looks great.
Okay, fantastic.
I think it just needs to be in the presentation mode. Yeah, oh, there it is.
Okay, wonderful. Hi, everybody. I'm delighted to be with you all today as we discuss and share all things Radcliffe. I'm very honored to be presenting with Angela and Deborah. Those were fantastic papers, both of whom have been so supportive of my own research. So if you look at my slide here, I have an image of Arundel Castle. This is an illustration from around 1815. Radcliffe actually visited Arundel Castle in July of 1800, and we know that because one of the extracts from her travel journals tells us about that experience. And the reason that I wanted to draw this out for you is that post-Italian, so post-1797, Radcliffe was particularly inspired to respond creatively to the site she visited with her husband. So I'll be circling back to this image of Arundel Castle and why that might be important later. So just file that back in your memories for now. So today I will be sharing my research on Radcliffe's little known post-1797 works by giving you a short overview of their publication history and context before ending with a short look at one of Radcliffe's lesser known poems. So to begin, cast your imaginations back to the first months of 1797, in which the Italian, the final Gothic romance to be published during Radcliffe's lifetime, made its entrance into the literary market. Its publication marked the height of Radcliffe's unprecedented popularity, for which she famously received an unheard of £800 advance from her publishers. No contemporary reader could have imagined, as they excitedly opened the first crisp volume of the Italian and read of Elena's thrilling adventures, that this would be the last of Radcliffe's work to be published for almost 30 years, when a 4-volume collection finally appeared in 1826, 3 years after Radcliffe's death. So here I wanted to give you just an overview of what you can actually read in this 4-volume collection. I really encourage everyone to go seek this out. You can read it for free on Google Books. It's all very, very fascinating and really, really relatively forgotten once you get past Radcliffe's last novel, which I'll talk about in a minute. So the first thing that you'll see when you open up these volumes is Thomas Dean Tolford's Memoir of the Life and Writing of Mrs. Radcliffe. T.N. Tolford was commissioned by William Radcliffe to write this prefatory memoir after Radcliffe's death in 1823. And it outlines Radcliffe's life and ancestry before turning to an analysis of her 1790s romances. It's the only kind of biography or memoir we have that touches on her final novel, Gaston of Blonville. So his memoir contains extracts from Radcliffe's journals, where we get a really good overview of the extensive traveling that she did with her husband post-1800. And it's a fascinating look at the way in which she, sort of what Deborah was touching on, how she starts to think about Britain's landscape. If we move to the second, number 2 on my slide, this Gaston of Blonville is the next text that you're going to see in these volumes. It's a pastiche of a medieval manuscript, which purports to be from the mid-13th century. It tells the tale of Henry III's court as it retires to Kenilworth Castle for a wedding, where a favorite knight of the king's is accused of murder. Then we get to St. Alban's Abbey and Metropol Tale, which is number 3 on my slide. This is Radcliffe's first narrative poem. So again, we see Radcliffe shifting gears here. It tells the tale of the First Battle of St. Albans, which took place in 1455. In case you don't know about that battle, which has become very obscure history nowadays, this is often considered by historians to be the opening conflict which started the Wars of the Roses. This narrative poem is quite lengthy. It runs to over 300 pages, and then we have a lot of footnotes as well. Number 4 is Salisbury Plain Stonehenge. This is Radcliffe's second longest narrative poem, and in it, she starts to draw on Britain's ancient past. So she starts to look at Britain's Norse and Druid heritage. And it's a really interesting, it's Radcliffe's take on the origins of Stonehenge. And then finally, we have Edwy, which is a 3-part poem. It's a fairy poem, and it's set on the grounds of Windsor Castle. The 4th volume, which I have as number 6 on my slide, is it's contained in a section of the volumes called Miscellaneous Poems. And there's a selection of about 28 previously unpublished poems in that volume. So what I want to just briefly pull out here is that Radcliffe becomes increasingly more interested in looking at Britain's historical periods and looking at the past. So we have the medieval past, we have the Wars of the Roses, and then she starts to look at Britain's deep past as well. Interestingly, Edwy is actually, you might know the name of an Anglo-Saxon king. So she starts to gesture towards an Anglo-Saxon past as well. So why did Radcliffe mysteriously retire from the literary scene upon which he had left such an indelible mark, both in terms of the initial inception of the Gothic and its subsequent development? This remains one of the most intriguing unanswered questions for Radcliffe scholars today. On the whole, the majority of scholarly assertions which attempt to account for Radcliffe's unexplained retirement from the contemporary literary market center on theories surrounding her desire to distance herself from the emerging brand of what scholars have often referred to as the horror Gothic, spearheaded by Matthew Lewis's The Monk, published right before The Italian. The publication of these 2 novels marked an important point of divergence in the field of the Gothic, defined on the one hand by what has come to be identified as Radcliffe's Terror Gothic, operating on a ritualization of secrecy and half-realized suggestion, and Lewis's Horror Gothic, which was unapologetically graphic in its depictions of murder, incest, and rape. Indeed, in his introduction to The Italian, Nick Groom has argued, quote, that Radcliffe's literary standing was tarnished by The Monk, which was seen as being the spawn, however monstrous and illegitimate, of the Mysteries of Udolpho. Radcliffe appears to not only have been an author who was deeply engaged with contemporary reviews of her works, but also a writer who purposefully and carefully negotiated her status as a proper female author. According to Tan Tolford in his memoir, Radcliffe was, quote, tremblingly alive to every circumstance which could, by the remotest possibility, raise an inference injurious to the personal character she valued far above literary fame. While we must be circumspect in Tolford's carefully curated portrayal of Radcliffe as a female author who supposedly chose the propriety of social convention over authorial ambition, we can perhaps envision Radcliffe surveying the contemporary field of the Gothic in the years immediately following The Italian, and perhaps finding herself troubled by her subsequent association with Lewis's new horror Gothic on the one hand, and the overtly political text of other female authors such as Mary Wollstonecraft on the other. It is through these considerations that we can perhaps begin to account for Radcliffe's sudden shift in creative trajectory post The Italian. I do not argue, however, that this is an indication of Radcliffe's inherent conservatism. Indeed, in her last novel, Radcliffe presents us with her first straightforward depiction of the unexplained supernatural. This is indeed a radical departure from her previous body of work, in which supposedly supernatural instances were famously explained away by perhaps far-fetched rational explanations. In Gaston of Blonville, however, the climax of the novel occurs when Henry III is visited by an unworldly specter who is bent on bringing his murderer to justice. Radcliffe treads a purposeful, self-conscious, and carefully negotiated boundary in her later writing between her potentially transgressive subject matter and her reputation as a proper female author. As we know, the plots of her 1790s romances carried potentially radical messages concerning the rights of contemporary women in relation to patriarchal society and oppressive marital laws. However, she largely escaped the monstrous charge which Thomas Mathias and Richard Polwheel famously laid at the feet of other contemporary female authors such as Charlotte Smith, for instance. According to them, Radcliffe did not belong with these, quote, unsexed females, aligning her instead with a particular brand of female genius exhibited by near contemporaries such as Fanny Burney and Hannah More. An examination of Radcliffe's later work then allows us to better understand Radcliffe's careful handling of her authorial reputation. Her later texts continue to be suggestive in their plots, themes, and settings, encroaching on a field of knowledge traditionally held to be an exclusively male preserve, the nation's historical record. Here we see Radcliffe's later imagination becoming consumed by what Richard Norton has called, quote, an antiquarian impulse. In these texts, Radcliffe returns to Britain from her famous Southern European settings of the 1790s. For the first time since the castles of Atlan and Dunbane, we see Radcliffe self-consciously engaging with historical narratives of Britain's cultural heritage and its progress towards early 19th century conceptions of a national identity. However, these later works reveal Radcliffe to be an author whose political or ideological leanings are purposely subtle and continuously elusive. In her representation of the nation's past in her later works, she often presents us with characters and events which resist straightforward attempts to assimilate them within a broader narrative of early 19th century Britain's cultural, religious, and political development. Henry III, for instance, is depicted in Gaston as a monarch who was criminally negligent in his judgment as king. He allows an innocent man to be in prison for murder, while the true murderer, his own knight and personal favorite, is allowed to go free for the majority of the novel. While it is tempting to read Radcliffe's depiction of Henry III as straightforward critique of all monarchical privilege, Radcliffe repeatedly emphasizes how the narrator of the text, a 13th century monk named Grimbald, celebrates and anticipates the day when Henry's son, Edward I, will, quote, bind up the wounds of his country. And I have the full quotation for you there. Where then can we say that Radcliffe ultimately stands when we attempt to assign political motives to her last novel, especially when we consider the violence of Edward I's own reign in his later attempts to subdue the Scots? Such attempts to label Radcliffe's later texts with straightforward political leanings are continually stymied. Any attempt at doing so in Gaston is further frustrated when we consider Radcliffe's odd decision to set the novel almost 10 years before the Second Barons' War, the most famous event in Henry III's largely forgotten reign. It was a civil war, essentially. In doing so, we can see Radcliffe gesturing towards a period of great civil disturbance, while simultaneously sidestepping a more overt depiction of the war itself. To conclude, I will briefly discuss one of Radcliffe's lyrical poems. And I have the table of contents for you this is all from the 4th volume. So entitled Forest Lawns, this poem is the 12th text in the miscellaneous section of Radcliffe's later works. Radcliffe was often creatively inspired during this period of her life by the viewing of England's historical sites, which she visited with her husband on holiday. The setting of Gaston of Blonville, for instance, is inspired by Radcliffe's touring of Kenilworth Castle in the beginning of 1802. Justice in Alban's Abbey is inspired by her repeated visits to the cathedral during the first decade of the 19th century. In attempting to assign a particular creative impulse to Radcliffe's lyrical poems, we can glean certain clues from her travel writing. Radcliffe writes of her prolonged observations of certain forest lawns on her journey to Arundel Castle in July 1800. And I have the full quotation here for you. It's a really fascinating example of the Radcliffes on tour, so to speak. So of this trip, she writes, "We soon entered upon the domain of Arundel, the road winding finely among its pompous woods and rough forest lawns. Partly by the tedious ascent and partly by the delay at the summit, these 4 miles occupied an hour and a half. Based on the amount of time which it took to ascend the downs surrounding Arundel, can we perhaps surmise that this view made a particular impression on Radcliffe's imagination, resulting in the poem which took the environs of Arundel as creative inspiration? Finally, I will gesture towards one last central tenet of Radcliffe's later creative practice. These texts often represent England's landscape as a many-layered accretive annal or palimpsest, whereby the successive periods of the nation's past disturb or subtly haunt narratives of a cohesive national heritage. And here is a quotation from Forest Lawns. So, "O ye stern-browed oaks that raise your giant arms on all the scene, how like your parent druids ye appear, lonely, severe, and in your grandeur dark. Your fearful shades like superstitious night fall on the awestruck spirit." Here, Radcliffe figures the ancient oaks which surround the speaker to be the progeny of Britain's ancient druids, a people that Radcliffe returns to in her narrative poem, Salisbury Plains. In her allusion to the druids, however, Radcliffe leaves us with yet another suggestion of England's deep past, which eludes straightforward reading. She centralizes the druids as important progenitors of England's history and even its landscape, while at the same time signaling their association with pagan superstition bound up in a national inheritance of violence. Radcliffe's later texts then are distinctly double visioned in their representation of Britain's history. And it is through Radcliffe's very refusal to present us with more overt readings of the nation's past that we can gain deeper insight into her creative imagination post-1790s. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Thank you. Really, really showing there that, Radcliffe is so much more than her most famous texts. And your work is clearly challenging what we might expect from such a hugely important and overwhelming, sometimes like overarching presence of someone like Radcliffe. But there's so much more going on. I love the fact that you were writing about her poetry. Thank you. I know hardly anything about it. It's made me want to go and read some more of it.
You should.
Thank you. We're going to open up the floor to questions now. So I've got all our speakers and members of the Gothic Women team here. And if anyone would like to raise their hand or type a question into the chat box that I can read out, I can put that to our panel. We have about just under half an hour for these questions now. I do have a question that I want to ask myself. Maybe that I'll kick us off while we're just getting started. So, Elizabeth, you mentioned that memoir of Radcliffe.
Yes.
So I just wondered, as a kind of question to all of you, that to what extent it matters how, from what I understand as not a non-Radcliffe expert, how little we know of her kind of personal life. She is quite elusive as a figure, right? So does that inform your editing, your research as individuals or as collaboratively on the project, compared to how you might approach someone like Mary Shelley or indeed Mary Wollstonecraft, who we know a little bit more about? Does that make sense? I don't know if you want to. Do you want to go first, Elizabeth? Or
I was just waiting to see if anyone else wanted to jump in. It's certainly a challenge when thinking about Radcliffe and her life. And I think a lot of the time what happens when we look at these memoirs that we do have is that they almost, because there was this mystery from the very beginning, really, of this huge gap from post-Italian to when this collection that I'm talking about appeared. People just didn't know what happened to her. People thought she was dead, when in fact, she was about 33 when she stopped publishing her work. So there was sort of an air of mystery about her, which I think contributed in a way to the sort of mythologizing of her life. And she sort of gets a little bit, her people imagined that her life was sort of Gothic in a way, because there were all sorts of rumors that perhaps she had gone mad and she was imprisoned in Haddon Hall, which is a beautiful house in Derbyshire. And so there's a lot of speculation. There were several works that appeared that were attributed to Radcliffe at the time, unauthorized collections of poetry. And Sir Walter Scott wrote a memoir of Radcliffe, that was 1824. So he didn't know at that point about Gaston of Blonville or the later works. But he sort of gives an account of her life, but then moves on, like Tolford, to sort of an analysis of the works that we have. So a lot of the time, biographers tended to just turn to her works and speak to her works, rather than giving, an account of her life beyond, the kind of paltry facts that they did have at the time. But that's a great question, Anna.
Yeah, just something I'm interested in. I don't know, Angela, do you want to go on?
Yeah, just to follow on from that, I think that Tolford's memoir of Radcliffe is very hygienic and carefully curated, because William Radcliffe apparently, was breathing over his shoulder as he wrote it. And that leaves us with a false impression, one that you get through, the film Becoming Jane, where there's this fictional encounter between Jane Austen and Anne Radcliffe, where Anne Radcliffe, played by Helen McCrory, is kind of very nervous and jumpy as a character. But the Commonplace book that is in Boston Public Library, I think Elizabeth's absolutely right. It shows that she was kind of reading massively and writing continuously between the Italian and well, Gaston was written between 1802 to 3, but she kept writing, and she also crucially kept reading as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I teach that film to my students. It's interesting to see their reactions. Deborah.
Yeah, the one thing I was going to say was that as someone who's interested in Radcliffe's politics, I think one of the frustrating things is the way, or the temptation, I suppose, to read her politics through the men around her. So either through the dissenting circles that she was associated with, or through the reviewers who are kind of, you know, making an exception out of her. And it's both of those things are kind of, from a feminist perspective, like not quite satisfying or satisfactory, but it's paying attention to the quite kind of complex polyvocal politics that you get in the works itself. It is a matter of teasing things out and kind of according due force to that context, but not letting it take over. It's something that I think about a lot in doing this work.
Well, thank you so much. No, that was three really interesting answers to what I was thinking, what the thoughts were going on in my mind. Laura's got a hand up, so I'm going to pass over to Laura, and I'm going to have a look at the questions that are coming in the chat. If anyone wants to continue to put your questions in the chat, please do. But Laura, go ahead.
Oh, it was a question for Angela. I'm really fascinated by the European translations of Udolpho, and I just wondered if we knew if much scholarship has been done on how they were translated, if they were adapted in translation, and also the reception in France and Germany and Italy.
Yes, I do know that, but I mean, I have to give credit here to a fantastic scholar called Fanny Lecotte, who wrote a chapter on the French translations of Anne Radcliffe for the Cambridge History of the Gothic, Laura, because she's charted very effectively how Victorine de Chastenay's 4-volume Les Mystères d'Udolphe is in fact quite faithful to the original in many ways, but she also notes that according to the political winds in France, you know, they would be adapted very, very liberally and freely, and I think that you know, that's probably the same in other places. There's quite a few translators who have really interesting prefaces talking about what we're changing in it, and then they actually moderate the plot in places as well. And you know, Fanny Lecotte's also demonstrated that there are just as many male translators doing this in France as female translators, which is really fascinating.
Yeah, Wollstonecraft's Wrongs of Woman was translated by a male translator, and the politics, the radical politics, in my opinion, actually there are people who disagree with me, but in my opinion they don't come across at all. So yeah, it's a really interesting question. I'm fascinated that it was quite faithful, because I mean, if you compare with, say, the French translation of Sense and Sensibility, which completely changes the ending, you know, it's interesting that Radcliffe was making it across the channel relatively intact.
Yes, she is, and there are many translations of her work and adaptations of them as well. And in fact, there's this great novel later in the 19th century where Anne Radcliffe becomes a vampire hunter. You know,
I just put that in the chat, Angela.
Perfect, Alban. What's it called again, Lauren?
It's called La Vie Vampire, or Vampires.
La Vie Vampire. Yeah, that's a great one. I remember reading that.
Yeah, I've just put it in the chat as you said it, so that was good timing.
Okay, that's definitely the next thing I'm going to look at as soon as this ends.
Okay, so next question from Charlotte Smith, not that one, is talking about readership and audience. So how does kind of what your real talks have discussed linked to potentially what research in English literature has been going on in regards to reading the Gothic and who was reading Anne Radcliffe and the significance of who her audience was. I mean, I feel like that's a question for all of you. I don't know if anyone would like to respond.
Where is the question again, Anna?
So
Sorry.
I'll just read it out to you because the chat's getting a bit full. So how much work has been done on reading in the Gothic, and as in what people are reading and the potential significance of this? So who was reading Radcliffe, and does that matter?
Yeah. I don't know, does anyone want to go first? Elizabeth, Deborah?
I think Charlotte may be thinking about what the characters in the novels read, right? Which is in a lot of texts of these periods, like not just the Gothic, such a big issue. There was kind of big educational questions about kind of how you read, what you read, and it is interesting because there's so much condemnation of reading the Gothic, and then you get a slightly weird thing that happens where you get novels and Gothic novels that condemn other novels or other Gothic novels kind of at the start and try to distinguish themselves. So I think it is like a big theme, if you like, and pick your text, and I think there's interesting things going on in it. I was thinking about Wollstonecraft's Maria, or The Wrongs of Women, and what she reads and how her reading leads her in different directions, and what the kind of national implications of that reading are, for example. So yeah, I think there is work happening, and probably more to be done in the field.
I suppose it's basically what I said in my talk. In The Romance of a Forest, there's a lot of concentration upon what Adeline is reading as well. And it emphasises Latin and English classics. So I think that Radcliffe treads a very careful path of didacticism to her young readership, telling them what a good education should look like. And that's a bit like Frances Burney, especially in Camilla. But she also, through that Provencal Tale and in other instances, shows a real pleasure of taking up a tale and reading or consuming a very complex story. And I think that I remember seeing this sign in Waterstones, which is like, put the fire on, pour yourself a glass of wine and curl up with one of our Gothic books. And that's often how I imagine, the Provencal Tale in the Mysteries of Udolpho working. That's what Ludovico is doing. So I don't think that she is condemnatory, but she is interested in what her heroines read, but also says that sometimes those texts aren't the ones that we need, if that works. And I agree with Deborah that it's basically all over the Gothic as well, isn't it? Yeah.
With Radcliffe, there's also a kind of interesting thing where with her use of epigraphs, which is so striking in terms of what she's reading and the places where it might not match up with what is good for her characters to read. I'm thinking of that, the reference to the mysterious mother, for example.
Yes,
so,
absolutely.
Yeah, there's just those interesting moments.
Yes, a mysterious mother. I mean, Deborah touched upon a really important thing there, Radcliffe's use of epigraphs, which really came into force in the later novels. And the mysterious mother, which you think, she shouldn't be reading. And in fact, I was asking a question about that just last week in one of the meetings, how would she have read something like The Mysterious Mother? Because it wasn't officially published, I don't think, until 1798, although there were pirate copies. So the epigraphs are another source of fascinating scholarship. There's a lot more to do, Charlotte, basically. Elizabeth?
Yeah, I mean, I think tropes of women reading in the Gothic are certainly a really, really important facet, as y'all are saying. I think y'all are absolutely right in pulling that out. I think what I often think about looking at these later works and Radcliffe's interest in the history of Britain, or Britain's history, is that she becomes interested in antiquarian reading. And so in Gaston of Blonville, she quotes from Matthew Paris, and she's looking at medieval sources that would have been written in Latin. She looks at local antiquarians. So she looks at William Dugdale, who was an antiquarian in Warwickshire, who wrote a lot of history about Kenilworth Castle. And when I was first looking at Gaston, I remember, trying to tease out how much, would she have been able to read it in the original Latin? Did she have an education like Emily did or Adeline did? I think Richter Norton, who wrote a biography, a really well-researched biography of Radcliffe, sort of assigns a lot of the endnotes, the footnotes that Radcliffe includes in these later texts to William Radcliffe, which I sort of don't like. I hope that she wrote them herself. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, especially in thinking about how she would have had access to those antiquarian texts.
Oh, thank you all. Yeah, apologies, Charlotte. I twisted your question into who was reading Radcliffe as opposed to what they're reading in Radcliffe, which is another factor of literature scholarship and for who's reading the novels, but maybe we'll come back to that. But thank you for your question, Charlotte. So the next one I have is actually asking to all speakers, could you name Victorian women writers? So thinking about Radcliffe and legacy. Could you name Victorian women writers of Gothic literature who inherited, reinvented, or contested Radcliffe's literary legacy? Maybe we'll come back to Angela first.
Well, the one that I was thinking about, I thought about putting her in my presentation, but I stopped, was Charlotte Bronte. I think Radcliffe is definitely there throughout Jane Eyre, and the descriptions of Thornfield Hall and Rochester coming towards Jane Eyre. But she's also actually mentioned by name in her novel Shirley, where Caroline Helston questions a younger woman who is reading the Italian, and they have a really interesting exchange about that. So, I guess that my contribution to that would be Charlotte Bronte, and of course it's there throughout the Brontes, I guess.
Yeah, great answer. Deborah, what do you think?
I was also going straight for the Brontes. It was where my mind went first. But I'm going to be slightly cheeky here because this isn't a woman writer, but I have a wonderful PhD student, Taylor Braithwaite, who is working on Reynolds' Mysteries of London, and her research has kind of thrown up like how Radcliffe is kind of still popular, still in the mix, and kind of being kind of widely read and kind of regurgitated in that very popular format. It's interesting the kind of vicissitudes of her reputation post Walter Scott, but yeah, like I think even when influence isn't directly acknowledged, she's very much in the mix, and thinking about how she impacts women's ghost stories. We had our ghost story seminar last time around throughout the 19th century, and it would be really interesting.
This is sort of getting towards the end of the Victorian era, even the beginning of the 20th century, but I always like to think of Charlotte Perkins Gilman, the yellow wallpaper, the tropes of imprisonment, and we mentioned Mary Wollstonecraft and Maria, and how the imprisonment in the insane asylum sort of lends itself to that. The Gothic pops up everywhere, I think, in certain ways, in the Radcliffe as well. And there's Gothic elements in Dickens' London that we have, and Miss Havisham in her wedding dress, and all of that wonderful, very evocative detail that Dickens gives us there. I think we could think about that as perhaps being Radcliffean.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth, and thanks Deborah and Angela as well. And the next question was from Alexia, who I saw you came out and came back in, so I was waiting to make sure you were back here, but you have your hand raised. So would you like to ask the question yourself? If you want to unmute.
Hi, sorry, yeah, I had a problem with my connection. That's why I was wondering if my question got deleted. Thank you so much. But if the question is there, I've actually lost it on my connection. But I wanted to ask whether, given Anne Radcliffe's interest in ruins and tombs, and there are obviously several grave scenes, does she actually refer to archaeological digging either in the Mediterranean or in Britain? Perhaps I've read her novels, but I haven't read some of those works that were in the last slide, for example. I was just wondering if in letters she refers to archaeological activities, and particularly in Wiltshire, for instance, barrow opening. Thank you.
Anyone want to?
Is anything springing to mind? I feel like there's a distant bell ringing, but I can't locate it.
Her journey, which is published in 1795, has appended to a tour of the lakes, but there's also excerpts in the south of England. She talks about structures a lot. And what she's visiting, and gives us very careful sort of choreography of buildings. It's not the same as archaeological sites, I know, but she is very, very attentive to the fabric of buildings and of ruins in that English section of the journey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know in that English section of the journey, she talks about her visit to the stone circle at Castlereagh, which includes another allusion that she makes to the Druids. Yeah. I think she was probably familiar with maybe earlier antiquarian or archaeological studies of early studies of Stonehenge. Yeah. And she was writing Salisbury Plains. And Angela, how, you're saying the attention to detail of just the ruins and the buildings that she visited. And I think she really studied the ruins of Kenilworth. And you can see that, especially in the introduction to Gaston of Blonville. She draws specific attention to certain architectural features of the ruins, and she compares them to other places that she's visited. And she visited Penshurst Place. And she talks about the fireplace and the ruins of the fireplace at Kenilworth Castle. So yeah, she was definitely interested in the physical remnants of the past in that way. Yeah.
And in Europe as well, in the Italian, her heroine Eleanor de Rosalba, at the beginning of the novel, before she's abducted, works for a living and does tapestries. And one of the tapestries she's doing is of, I think it's Herculaneum rather than Pompeii. I'm just hesitating because I'm not sure, but I mean, there is that sort of indirect reference to Herculaneum, which shows that she knew and was very well versed in the discoveries there.
That was the bell that was ringing for me, Herculaneum, in some way.
Yeah.
Thank you. So the next question is, are there Gothic scholars currently interested in using most advanced machine learning and AI for analysis of styles of anonymous text published after the Italian, trying to see if Anne Radcliffe kept publishing but anonymously? Or if Gaston was partly written by her husband, as rumours had it, something I didn't know about. I don't know if anyone on our panel would like to respond to that question.
That's a wonderful question. As far as using advanced machine learning, I don't know. Angela, Deborah, have y'all ever come across any of that?
No.
As far as I know, there aren't. I think there were, like I touched on earlier, there were certainly rumors that she did continue to publish. There were a couple of unauthorized publications of poetry, and we know that Radcliffe was very disturbed by the attribution of the plays of the Passions, Joanna Baillie's work, to herself, and she was very upset by that. as far as we know, this very carefully curated volumes that were published in 1826, those are, I think, that was William Radcliffe wanting to officially set the record straight and say, these are the works that my wife was working on. And I think in some ways that's why he wanted Tolford to write the preparatory memoir, to address the rumors that have been circulating about what might have happened to her after the Italian, or whether she was still writing in that interim. I hope that helps to answer that question.
There's also a really helpful note from Verlana in the chat about machine learning studying Gothic.
Yeah. I know that Jacqueline Howard, the scholar, has done some work in attributing texts after the Italian to Radcliffe, although I think that there's still some uncertainty and speculation there. I'm not sure that I agreed with her findings in those. I think it would be fascinating if somebody used those mechanisms to work on that and on her poetry as well.
The next question is from Isabella, who says, I believe, Angela, as you're editing Radcliffe at this time, what is one of the things you're thinking of conveying about her writing or her mindset that you can glean as you're putting it all together?
Yeah, so I mean, the three of us are editing Radcliffe for the Cambridge edition, and I guess the three of us might agree that actually it changes vastly from 1789 up to the end of her life. I think that there is a kind of change, particularly in the later works. In the Italian, and Robert Miles has done some great work in this, about the politics and the treason trials and the suspension of habeas corpus in 1797, and how that may be figured or represented in the Italian. And, I was sort of trying to suggest as well in Udolpho, which is 1794, I'm just really intrigued by that little smuggling of opinion and to that in these degenerate days that she puts in when Ludovico is reading the Provencal Tale. I kept kind of pondering why she would put that in and what it meant. But I think that there is a difference between Castles of Atlan and Dunbane, a Sicilian romance, which is quite optimistic in its preface, to Udolpho and the Italian. And we'll certainly be thinking about that in our introductions, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm teaching a Sicilian romance tomorrow, so that's interesting. We are coming close to 6:30. So what I'm going to do now, but I can feel like that I really want Deborah and Elizabeth to have a chance to respond to that question about editing as well. I'm actually going to hand over to Laura Kirkley, who is also on the Gothic Women Project team as the host. I'm going to stop the formal recording for the event and say to everyone who's here, please look out for our next event, which is on Gothic bodies. Not quite available to book yet, but look out for the booking page, which we'll be sharing. But if I just close this event now that I'm at the formal part of the event has ended, but further questions responding to that point about editing and the exciting Cambridge Radcliffe edition will continue. So Laura, do you want to